I'm Jamshid Damooei. I'm professor of economics and director of economics program. I have the pleasure of directing the Center for Economics of Social Issues. I want to bring an important topic to your attention, the issues about economic democracy. I want to ask this question: is United States economic system a democratic system? This topic hardly gets discussed in the media or in the economic debate or in our political discourse. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to share with you. And as we go over these issues and examine some of these premises, I want you to, if possible, to allow yourself this possibility to look at this information without any preconceived ideas. Maybe you can find something that you could probably look into yourself and say that, well, I would like to know more about it. That's really the purpose. It's just have a discussion about some of these important issues that we ignore and we don't really bring them up in our discourse. So the issue is economic disparity is the product of the working of an economic system. And that's with the United States or anywhere else. Having undemocratic economic system is the reason for the inequalities and particularly the poverty. And then the other issue is that, do we have any solutions? And I strongly believe that we do have solutions for many of our economic problems. The first set of information has this title: rich are becoming richer and poor are getting poorer. I'm pretty sure that many of you see that, in your own experience of how the economic events have changed. But this is the information for 50 years from 1968 to 2018. They put together by the Pew Research Center, and those data really come straight from the US Census. So in that 50 years, 1968 to 2018, the top 20% of American income earners used to make 43% of the total income. That has increased to 52%. But 20% doesn't really give you exactly where this earning of more income actually occurred. So we look at the 5%. The 5% used to make about 16%, and now they're making about 23%. But you never really solve this problem unless you focus on the very top 1% of the income earner. And here are some of the more recent information about the 1%. The 1% in 2021, the year that we are in, are making about 21% of the total income earned in the United States. If you think the income distribution is so bad, one day you look at the wealth distribution, it's much worse. The top 1% in 1990 used to make about 23.5% of the total wealth, or own 23.5%, and now earn about 31.1% of total wealth. And if you really look at other wealth groups or those demographic groups, you see that the 90 to 99 percentile, which means the 9% below the 1%, they used to make about 37% of the wealth. They're owning a little bit more, about 37.7%. And if you look at the 50th to 90th percentile, which means exactly the 40% below the 10%, they were making about 35.9%, almost 36% of the wealth. And now they only own about 28.2%. And if you go to the very bottom, 50% of Americans, they used to own about 3.6% of the wealth, and that has been reduced to 2%. So there is no doubt that the concentration of wealth over this time has been really towards the very top 1%. Let's look at the second one. Here we're looking at a very important economic issue, which is the challenge of decoupling wages and productivity. Let me explain that in a much clearer way. Up to 1973, so if you look at the cursor, here is from 1948, just after the war, right up to 1973, productivity and compensation, they followed each other. We call them dovetail. And then in 1973, they diverge. Productivity is going up as you see it here in this diagram, the compensation are not following that. There is no dovetailing here. If you break this up into seeing that what category of income earner are making about productivity or higher than productivity or lower than productivity, you can really find that in this diagram very clearly. The top 1% of earners are making about 137% more, which is more than twice as productivity. Productivity during this period of time, which by the way is from 1979 to 2013, the productivity increased by just about 61.9 or 62%, and their earnings, the top 1%, is 137, looking at the end of that period of time under consideration. But the tragedy is that the 90% of Americans, so this is what you get here in the bottom line, while the productivity increased by almost 62%, their cumulative wages, 90% of American workers, only increased about 15.2%, a quarter of productivity. So if we come with that idea that people, 90% of Americans, do not really feel that they share the prosperity that happened over this period of time, I think this data pretty much backs that, proves that that's exactly the case. And by the way, those who were making like 4% under the top 1% and 95%, they made about the productivity. And those which were between 90 to 95 percentile, which is the 5%, the half of the top 10%, the lower part of the top 10%, they were making just about 60% of the productivity. So this is the situation that we really have to pay close attention to, because this is not getting better, it's getting worse. And let's move on. We may ask that question, how about racial and ethnic disparity in compensation and wages? And that is a pretty complicated and rather difficult situation to accept. Because if you look at these three charts that they are here, I mean, they present different things. And by the way, if you like a copy of this presentation, I'm pretty sure you can find it from the School of Management. But if not, just send me an email and I'll be glad to email it to you. Let's get back again to these charts. So if you look at these charts, the one that is very telling is that the first one just tells us that all wages fail to rise with productivity, which I think we pretty much established that in the early discussion. But the other part is rather difficult to accept, and that is that the Black men wages are lower than white men. The Black women wages are lower than the white men. Women wages are less than the men. And if you really look at these issues and you ask yourself, was that something that happened in the past? Is it getting better? But again, this data can tell you quite clearly that that's not the situation, because if you look at here, the adjusted hourly wage gap relative to white men by race and gender. So if you look at that, you could say that, you know, in the early part of this period of time that we're looking at, that period of time that we're looking at is from 1979 to 2015. So the early part of it, it was getting better. So you can see that, you know, you see a decline in at least in these two lines. But then when we get to about the last 20, 25 years, that's not getting better. If anything, it's kind of stagnating at that level. And if you look at the racial bias in compensation, you can clearly see that very last line here, which is the compensation of the Black men, slightly improved, fluctuated, but certainly still stay quite significantly below the white men. Let's move on. Let's bring this question. How about attaining a higher education? Did that change the picture? And it's rather sad to really say that this is not the case. The educational attainment did not reduce racial or gender bias. And if you look at the way that these charts are presented, and again, study them, you know, maybe closer later on, you find that those who actually had high school diploma and less, the bias stayed pretty much the same. But those who have higher education, that did not really reduce the gap. And it's rather sad to say that even in some respects, it got worse. So this is a complicated question. So how will these things change during the 21st century? How would these structurally we deal with these biases? There are plenty of studies about why, for example, we have gender bias in pay. And quite honestly, a significant proportion of these studies indicate that childbearing is one of the issues. So if you really look closer at that issues, when we think about family issues, we have to have sets of laws and provisions that make men and women be equally, impacted in any way by all the consequences or the developments of life. And I think this is something that some countries have positive experience, and we should really try to bring that in a much broader extent and discuss it and find solutions for them. And by the way, these solutions exist. There's a question of can we make commitment towards taking those solutions and follow them? Let's move further. We're talking about American dreams here. That is known to all of us. If you work hard and if you commit yourself to do better, you will do better. Is that true? Well, there is a indicator which is called, intergenerational social mobility. Simple language. It means that our kids doing better than their parents. Now, if you look at the study done by Raj Chetty and his group when they were actually at Stanford University, this is put out by the Stanford Center for Poverty and Inequality. In their studies, they show that in 1940, 90% of Americans, when they were born in 1940, did better than their parents. But when you look at the more recent group of people, 1980, they're only 50% are doing better. So is that enough for us to say that American dream is fading away? I leave it to you, but to me, that's very clear. Now let's look at how other countries are doing here, or with regard to social mobility. In US, this is a very important piece of information. In US, 8% of children raised in the bottom 20% of income. Only 8% of those children can climb up the ladder and get to the 20% on the top. That is twice in a country like Denmark. So if you're talking about American dreams, let's think about it. Where does it exist? In the United States or in other countries? Now, let's go a little further. This is the study by OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, includes a group of highly advanced industrialized countries. So you could make a kind of comparison between many of them. So the chance of being victimized by crime, exposed to environmental toxin, having unmet healthcare needs is far greater in the United States among the poor than any other country in the OECD countries around the world. So these are the issues that we have to really look very closely. Now, the problem is this, or I think one of the problems is that in the United States, when you think about economic success is perceived as a result of individual effort. You may say, what's wrong with that? But if you go further, rugged individualism, self-reliance, and are the realities of what is called American character. But if you translate that to real life, it means that the United States, it's rather unfortunate that many people think if people are poor, it's a result of their own work, because they either maybe work hard, they were lazy. So in other words, being poor is a problem caused by poor people. That's not the case in many other countries. When they see people in poverty, they think that's a result of the way that the economy works, opportunities are provided, educational attainment, working condition, so many other factors. They see it as social and environment of the economic problems, not that the problems of the poor. So you may feel good about it, that was individual effort, but when you translate it to understanding of the economy work, the consequences, the outcome is rather deplorable. So where do we go with this? I think we're getting to what the heart of this discussion is. Do we have economic democracy in the United States? And let us go in that by first trying to have an understanding of what economic democracy is about. Well, one way to explain that, we have to think about that. Who are the ones who make decisions? Important decisions, like what to produce, how to produce, who does the production, for whom to produce. If you look at the United States, most of these decisions in our production system is made by the owners of the corporations, companies. We call them shareholders. Shareholders' affairs are run by their directors, the people, professional people they hire. And basically, they, so to speak, call the shots. Now let's examine that. Is that true? Is production something, or decisions about production, how to produce and all that, is entirely something that should be made by corporate owners, by shareholders? There is a concept in economics that I invite you to pay close attention to. It's called externalities. Externalities could be actually positive or negative. In plain language, externality means cost to third party or benefit to third party. Let's look at it. You live somewhere and a company moves there. It's a giant company, huge warehouse. Trucks, big trucks are coming every day, congesting the traffic, polluting the environment, and you live in that area. That is going to affect your benefit, your health, even the value of your property. Shouldn't you have any voice about it? You're bearing the cost of it. How can you bear the cost of something that somebody else is doing and you have no voice? That gives you a window to look into what economic democracy is about. So one idea is that decisions should not be made just by corporate owners. Decisions should be made by all those who are impacted by those decisions. Workers are in the front line of it. Workers are impacted by the way that companies make decisions. Why shouldn't they have a voice about it? Well, you can see it, that labor unions are in terrible shape, in particular in private sector. And they have been, they've been a kind of pressure on them for the last, several decades. And most people look at labor union as well, kind of adversarial force. Why should they be adversarial force? They're part of the economic democracy. They're part of making decisions. Their affairs should be also looked at. And also neighborhood have a say, because that's where the production happens. Consumers have actually have a say. You may say that, well, they practice because they can buy or not buy. True, but consumers should be given full information. And information is very important. Decisions made without information is not worth anything. So if you look at this environment, if you look at what participation has in making decisions, you get the point what economic democracy is about. But let me go a little further than that. We actually learned a lot more about that. There is another angle to economic democracy, which is very important to bear in mind. And that is that we could actually think about corporations as corporations owned by workers. It's called workers' cooperatives. Well, that may say that, well, that's another utopia. Well, how can possibly companies be owned by workers? But here, look at it. There are many examples of that. There are actually examples of the United States. I think it's about several hundred of workers' cooperatives that are very successfully operating in the United States. They're not as large as you can find them in countries like Italy or Spain, but they are in the United States too. But I just took one company out of Spain. We have a lot of workers' cooperative. And that is a company called Mondragon. This company has been around for 70 years. They have about 82,000 workers. You may call them shareholders. They have a total asset of more than 33 billion. Their annual income is more than 14 billion. They're representing 150 countries, and it's just one of the many. So the idea that workers' cooperative cannot survive, cannot operate, it's not viable, it's rather unrealistic. And it's not accurate, it's not correct either. So you can think about how corporations can run. And they can do just the same stuff as the corporations who are actually owned by owners can do. Now, if you look at this issue, so we have really before us two very clear pictures. One, we have what is called economic democracy. The other one may be, for the lack of terminology, or maybe there is terminology for it, that's called corporatocracy. I think what we have in the United States, in many respects, make it very clear that we have corporatocracy in the United States. Decisions are made by corporations, are pretty imposed by everybody else, whereas the process of production has a much bigger social and economic dimensions. Let's move on. We could actually ask ourselves, is US a fully functioning democracy? Now, that may actually sound very strange to many of you. Now, here's a study done by The Economist magazine. And this was actually done in 2020, Economist Intelligence Unit, only a few months ago. And they looked at 167 countries around the world, and they put them in 4 categories of full democracy, flawed democracy, hybrid regimes, and authoritarian regimes. It's rather unfortunate that the United States is in the second category, and actually is more on the higher place in the second category, but it's still in the second category. And the criteria that they measured the level of the democracy in these countries, the thematic issues are electoral process and pluralism, the function of the government, political participation, political culture, and civil liberties. And the United States scored pretty low on function of the government and the political culture. And actually, the score on the civil liberties are not that high either. So we have quite a lot of work on our hands, even for our democracy, not economic democracy, economy, the way it functions. Let's go a little further on that. OECD, that I mentioned earlier, categorized again about 32 countries based on the level of economic democracy. It's called Economic Democracy Index. And rather unfortunate that the US is really in the bottom of the group. You see the Scandinavian, Nordic countries are on the top, and countries like the United States, actually Japan, Chile, other countries are in the bottom. And that goes back again to some of those ideas that we talked about, how we perceive, participation in making economic decisions, how problems that people have are actually looked into. And then you can see the stark difference between different countries. And by the way, these countries are all capitalist countries. So let's make no mistake here. We're not talking about countries that are not run the way that US run. They are all of them are capitalism, but a different function, a different level, degree of economic democracy in these countries. Let's move on. The question is, how do we reach it? That's a very important question. First and foremost, we have to work on our own democracy, the political environment. Well, it's very clear that one of the most important issues here is that how election is done. In the United States, those who get elected are the ones who can raise the highest fund. And where these funds come from? Primarily, they come from giant corporations. They come from super rich. They have funds that you can just contribute without anybody knowing who you are. And these are the changes that happen in our legal system, in our election system. Elections are done on days that people probably find it very difficult to go and vote. Many political players trying to maybe reduce the participation of people in elections, and a lot of these issues. So that's not a functioning democracy. Having the Constitution is not enough. We have to practice it. We have to take simple money out of democracy. Then, democratization of the labor, strengthening of the labor union. I think it's very important for us to see this in one important element. Strengthening actually workers' cooperatives. That's a very important issue. Democratization of capital. Capital is not something that democratize in the United States. Capital usually are provided, whether it is our central bank, Federal Reserve System, or our own banking system, very geared towards providing that to those who already are very powerful and can easily raise capital. It's not possible for others. So we have to break up these giant firms. We have to really democratize capital in the United States, and that's very important. Strengthening nonprofit, greater emphasis on local economy, strengthening those who are local and also ecologically sustainable. UBI, universal basic income, that's inevitable. We may actually delay it, but at some point along the way, I think universal basic income is going to come. Provision of high quality education. Universal high quality education from early childhood to college. High quality healthcare. I mean, we've seen, what COVID has done to the lower income people in the United States, and it will continue. So these are important steps that we have to take. Creation, most important one, creation of fair tax system. Giant corporations have to pay their taxes, super rich, wealth tax. Here is the issue. When you look at how these things in other OECD countries are done, a country like France or Germany, they pay their taxes. These taxes are invested back in the economy and in the people. So if you see that what is their expenditure over proportion of their GDP, in a country like France, you get anywhere between 50 or more than 55%. Germany around about maybe 50%. Most European countries are around about 50%. United States is much lower. So this is investment. So you pay your taxes, fair taxes. These taxes are invested in the country, in the people, and that's a giant step towards creating a better economic environment. And what it really does, it fosters economic growth. Let us not forget, economic growth is physical. GDP, more production. Economic development is not physical. It's about enhancing people's choice, and is built on creating capacity in people, for people, so they can do better, they can reach their potential, and that would be a much more prosperous economy, and this is something that we have to work towards it. Well, this is my presentation. I hope that I raised some questions. I hope you ended up watching this presentation, ended up having more questions that you had in the beginning. Hopefully we get the chance to see you, not in virtual campus visit, but in real campus visits in other years. Have a wonderful time, and thank you very much for your attention.